Hello everyone, my name is Doug Giannotti. I'm a client technical architect with IBM, and today what I'd like to go through is step by step the process of deploying Maximo 7.6.1.X to a Red Hat OpenShift environment. As we move into 2021, the Maximo Enterprise Asset Management product will be moving into what's called the Maximo Application Suite. At this time, it will be a requirement that EAM, Maximo EAM, be deployed through a Red Hat OpenShift environment. This video will kind of give you a head start and allow you to practice and get familiar with some of the concepts as well as the deployment techniques of using Red Hat OpenShift. So the process that we're going to take today, we're going to go through the multiple steps that are required to deploy Maximo to OpenShift. So the first step we'll take is we will actually create what's called a Maximo workload, and we'll create two. We'll create one for the UI elements and one for the cron task elements. Once those workloads are created, we will then create a local Docker image that uses WebSphere Liberty as the base image, and we'll add the files that we created in the previous step, the Maximo workload files, to that image. Once that Docker image is created, we will publish that image into a repository, and then we'll move to the OpenShift side of this demonstration. We'll create an OpenShift project, and we'll pull those images that we created in the previous step into that OpenShift project. At that time, we'll have those containers deployed through OpenShift. The last couple steps, we'll create a service route so that you can make a URL call, so that's public, into the OpenShift environment. And lastly, we'll log into Maximo to view it through OpenShift. Okay, from a prerequisite perspective, first is we need a workstation for building the Maximo workloads. It could be Linux, Windows, doesn't make a difference. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to build the necessary ears and WAR files that are needed to deploy Maximo into a WebSphere Liberty environment. The second prerequisite is the Red Hat OpenShift environment, specifically 4.3 or 4.4 environment. Now, if you don't have OpenShift, there's a couple of choices you have here. You can go to try.openshift.com and you can get a 60-day free trial, or you could leverage OKD. So OKD is the community distribution of Kubernetes that essentially powers OpenShift. So if you don't want to use OpenShift, you can use OKD. If you want to use it in a home lab, or it doesn't make a difference. The next prerequisite is we need to have a Docker runtime local to this build environment. So what we're going to do is essentially we're going to be pulling down a base image containing or taking our files, those Maximo workload files, and then building an image based out of that. Once that image is built, we'll need the next prerequisite, which is a repository to contain those images. We're then going to take those images and push those up to a repository, and that repository needs to be available to OpenShift. And lastly, we need a Maximo database. So the assumption here is the database is not going to be containerized. It's going to be in a completely separate image or container outside of what we're doing from a Maximo container perspective. Okay, before we get into the demonstration, let's have a quick conversation on what a Maximo workload is. So when Maximo is deployed to WebSphere Liberty, it's deployed a little differently than it is to WebSphere Network deployment. And what I mean by that is when we deploy Maximo to WebSphere Liberty, what we have to do is we break the Maximo environment down into what's called a specific workload. A workload is really a complete task in Maximo that has been broken out. So if you look on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that the workloads that we have defined. We have a UI workload, we have a cron task workload, an API workload, a JMS consumer workload, a MIA workload, and a report workload. Now, only two of these are required to get Maximo up and running. That is the UI workload and the cron task workload. The other ones are all optional. So the API one references the older REST API, not the JSON API. The JMS consumer is if you are leveraging integration messages through JMS queue. The MIA is really the old Enterprise Web Services API. And reporting is if you want to segregate out the BERT reporting server into a separate task itself. So for this demonstration, what we're going to do is we're going to create two containers. One for the Maximo UI and the second for the Maximo cron tasks. So our first step is to go build these workloads, and they're very similar to how you build the Maximo EAM file. Under the Maximo deployments directory, there's a directory called WAS deployments, WAS Liberty deployments, and we'll go into there and we'll see the scripts that are there to build each of these given workloads components. You'll also see in that directory are the server configurations. So there's a server.xml file that Webster Liberty uses that has the necessarily features for each of the Webster Liberty containers or application server instances. So we'll modify those, we'll run the scripts to build the environment, and then we'll move on to our next step. There is a document online that goes through the instructions on deploying Maximo to OpenShift. And if you follow this URL, you will see this document, and it kind of goes through, like I said, the exact steps as well as some of the information I talked about previously. Now, I'm going to put all of the links in the description of this video so that you can use it to follow through. Now, with that said, let's get into the demo and let's go through the process of deploying Maximo to OpenShift. Now that I've given you a little information in regards to what's required from a prereq perspective and what the process is going to look like, let's actually now get into deploying Maximo on OpenShift. So what I have here, I have a Linux environment, and I'm going to be using this as both my building environment for the Maximo workload as well as creating and posting the Docker images. So the first thing we're going to need to do is going in and creating the Maximo workload. So to do that, I'm in my Maximo directory right here. We're going to go to deployments, and then once under deployments, we're going to go to the WAS Liberty default folder. Under there, we have scripts to run each of the components that build those Maximo workloads. But before we do that, we need to do one configuration piece. If we go under config servers, under there we have a folder that represents each of those given workloads. So for this example, I'll just go into the Maximo UI, and then under there there's another folder. Go under that. We'll see there's two files, the JVM options and the server option. The JVM option is where we specify the memory for that given JVM itself. So if we look under here, we're saying, set to 4 gigs, min and max of 4 gigs. If we go under the server.xml, you'll see here is where you need to go and make some changes. Now, the changes depend on the version of Webster Liberty that you're using. For this example, I'm using Webster Liberty 20.0.0.6, so it requires, a higher feature for Java Mail, JNDI, WAS JMS client, SSL, web profile, etc. And you'll see before, I modified this earlier, but you'll see two sections, one for a version of Webster earlier than I think it's 19, and one for a version that's greater. So for this demo, we're using Webster 20, so I'm using those given features. So you would make the changes if you need to. With that done, let's go up a couple of directories. And what we're going to do is we're going to now run the scripts that build both the Maximo UI and Maximo cron task environment. So I'll start with the Maximo UI. So within the Maximo UI environment, there's two scripts that we need to run, and you guys should be familiar with this from the just regular Maximo side. We have the build Maximo UI war, and we have the build Maximo-X war. So we'll just run this one first. And what it's going to do is it's going to build a Maximo war file, a UI war file, that will be used as one of the full files that we'll use to create a Docker file. So what I'll do is I'll just pause this until this is done. Okay, with that file successfully built, we will now continue on and build the Maximo X war file. Once again, we'll run this and we'll pause this until this is complete. Okay, that war file is complete. So lastly, we'll just build our last workload, and that is the cron workload. And to that, we're going to run this build maximo cron war.sh. So we'll run that. Once again, I'll pause this until it's done. Okay, the final workload has been built. So now, if we go into, you'll see that there's a deployment folder. If we go into the deployment folder, we'll see two folders under there, both that correspond to the given workloads that I created. So, and if I just go under the Maximo UI, you'll see that I have a couple things. I have a folder called apps under there, and under that apps folder, I have my two war files, as well as my server XML and JVM options that it pulled from that config servers folder. With the workload files created, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to build the Docker images. Now, before I do that, I like to simplify this process. So I will take all of these files and move them to a completely different file structure that's not as far down, deep down. So what I've done is I've created a folder called MX containers, as well as two subfolders under there, Maximo cron and Maximo UI. So I'll move all of these files that correspond to the UI into the cron in each of those respective files. And once again, this is just for my purpose from a simplicity perspective. So let me just copy these. And then I'll move to the cron. And I'm going to copy the same thing. The files are now copied, so let's actually go look at that staging environment. So I have once again, a directory called Maximo MX containers, and under there I have my two directories, Maximo cron, Maximo UI. Let's go under Maximo UI, and you'll see all of the files that I copied over there. Now, at this point, we'll start the process of creating the Docker image. And in order to start that, we need to create what's called a Docker file. So let's look at the Docker file that I've created. Okay. So in that file, the first thing I'm doing, you'll see from IBM Com WebSphere Liberty. That is, I'm starting with an image already created as my starting point. So I'm going to pull down the IBM WebSphere Liberty container, and I'm using the version 20.0.0.6. And I'm going to pull the full version with Java 8 and the IBM Java 8. Now, when I first did this, I did not pull the full version. I pulled what's called the kernel version, which is a stripped down version. In doing so, after I started deploying this, I got an error saying the feature sets per that WebSphere Liberty environment were not there. So I went back and I pulled the full. So remember, when you're doing this, pull the full. Now, there probably is a way to just pull the kernel version and then create a script that just adds those given features. But for simplicity here, I'm just pulling the full version. So I'm using that as my starting point. Then what I'm doing is I'm copying the two war files, the Maximo X and the Maximo UI war files, from my local environment into an environment within the container. So copying them from my apps Maximo X war to the /config apps directory. So I do that, and then I'm also going to copy the server.xml and the JVM options into the config file, and then I'm going to run a config.sh. With the Docker file successfully built, the next step in the process is to build a local container from that Docker file. So in order to do that, we're going to run a Docker command. We're going to say docker build -t, and the -t is for a tag name. So I'm going to just say mx/maximo, and then :1.0 is the version name, and then dot. And then I'll hit enter. Now what this is doing, it's going to go out and it's going to pull down from the IBM repository the WebSphere Liberty base container. It'll then continue in looking at the steps in the Docker file. So remember, those next steps are to then copy the WAR files into the container, as well as the server configuration file, the server.xml, the jvm.options file, and lastly, run the config.sh file, which sets up the internal mechanisms of that WebSphere Liberty container. Once the operation has completed, we could validate that the image was successfully created, and we can do that by running docker images-a. So we'll see that we have the local image that I created with my repository mx maximo with a 1.0 version. And then at the bottom, you will see the WebSphere Liberty container as that was downloaded and then used as the basis to make my local Maximo container. With the Maximo UI workload container successfully built, our next step is to repeat that process with the Maximo cron workload. So we'll go into our Maximo cron staging area, and once again, that's the area that has the apps, server.xml, and JVM options. We'll create a Docker file. And really, it's going to be almost identical to the previous Docker file. The only difference here is we are changing the name of the WAR file we're putting into the container. So since this is the cron workload, we are putting the Maximo cron.war into that workload. But if you look at the top, we're still pulling from the WebSphere Liberty image. We're pulling that full WebSphere Liberty image. We're copying the WAR file, the server.xml, the JVM options, and we're running the configure.sh. So with that done, I'm going to once again run my docker build -t. I'm going to call it mx maximo cron :1.0 for the version, and I'm going to run this. Now, since we've already pulled down that WebSphere Liberty image, it's going to reference that and then start building on top of that. So it'll then take the the WAR file, the server.xml, etc., and build that into a segregated container. Okay, the build's finished up. Now let's just validate that we have both of our containers, our local containers. So we can run docker images-a. And what we see, we have up top, we have our Maximo cron workload container, a local container. And then we have our Maximo UI workload container. And then at the bottom, we also have our Liberty container, which is encompassed into both of the other two containers. Continuing on. So now we have both of our images local. What we need to do is we need to post these up to a repository, an image repository. Now, OpenShift does have a built-in image repository by default. For the sake of this video, I'm going to post these images up to my Docker registry. And that Docker registry is going to be a public registry so that within my OpenShift, I can get to that. So the first thing I need to do is I need to change the tags on those images and create replicas. So I'm going to do sudo docker tag mx/maximo cron :1.0 ggni/maximo cron So I'm essentially just creating a tag copy, but the copy I'm creating is my Docker repository and my project name. So I'll do the same thing here. Sudo docker tag /maximo :1.0 /maximo 1.0. Okay, and if I do a docker images.a, I should see that now I also have the newly tagged images. I'm now going to push these images up to my Docker repository so that they will be available for OpenShift to access. So I will run docker push, and then, actually no, I'm lying. Before I do that, I need to log into Docker Hub. So I'm going to do sudo docker login. Since I've already logged in before, I had my credentials stored. Now that I am logged into my repository, now I can run my docker push, my repository name, project name, and the version name. So I'll start with the cron. And it is pushing that image that I created and I tagged up to my Docker repository. And we'll just wait for this to finish. Cron image was successfully pushed. Let's do the same thing, but let's do the UI image. And the Maximo UI image was successfully pushed up to my repository as well. Now, I can probably run a command to validate this, but what I'm just going to do is I am logged into my Docker profile here. Right now I have no repositories. If I just refresh this, I should see the two repositories that I created. One is my Maximo cron, one is my Maximo UI, and I can click into there. I can click in the tags. I can click in my 1.0, and I can look at images, information about the given image itself. And I can also see how, if I needed to pull it, how I would pull it. I would reference, docker pull, repository name, image name, version name. Before we continue on, let me just go over a recap of what we've done so far. So first, we created two Maximo workloads, the Maximo UI workload and the Maximo cron workload. We've then created two local Docker images that leverage IBM WebSphere Liberty as the base and files from those workloads, the WAR files, the XML files, etc., to form two local Docker images. Once those images were down, we then re-tagged those and we pushed those up to a Docker repository. Now, continuing on, we're going to shift our focus really to the OpenShift side. And what we're going to do is we're going to create an OpenShift project. We're going to then deploy those apps, those containers from the Docker repository into my OpenShift environment. We're at the home stretch now. So let's go and create an OpenShift project. And there's a couple ways you could do this. You could do it graphically within the OpenShift console, or you could do it through the command line interface. So I'm going to do it in the command line interface, but we'll view it in the console. So I need to log into my OpenShift environment. Now, I'm already logged into mine, and I can check that by running OC who am I. And because I'm referencing the kube-config file, I'm in as system admin, and I know that's not best practice, but for this demo, it's fine. If I wasn't logged in, I would do OC login and the domain where I'm logging into it. So with that set, I'm going to do OC new project and call this MX76. And it's now creating a project for us in our OpenShift environment. If I bring up my OpenShift console, if I go to projects, I should see this new MX 7.6 project that I created. Now we are going to deploy our containers that were pushed into our registry into our new Docker project. Now, since I created that project, I'm automatically associated with it right now. So I'm going to do OC new app, the registry where I'm getting it from, and the name of it. I'll start with the Maximo cron 1.0 and the version number. And it's now going to create this on the OpenShift side. How I can validate that, I'm going to go back into my console. I'm going to say developer. I'm going to look at the topology for my project. Now I can see that my Maximo cron container has been pushed to it. I can now start looking at the resources. So it's building the container based on the information that was in the server.xml that was part of that container. It's mapped service ports. But if I go in the log file, I can start seeing when the execution of the application server starts to kick in. And we'll just pause here for a second till that goes. And here it goes. Now what you'll see as we go on, we'll see the familiar piece where it connects to the Maximo database. It loads the system to properties, and at that point it's open for connections. Now, since we started with the cron, we're not there to make a UI connection, but at least from the container perspective, it made a JDBC connection to a database that I have that's not in the Red Hat environment. It's segregated outside of it, but it made that connection. So now we'll go back and we will do the exact same thing for the UI container. So we'll say OC, new app, registry name, container name, version. And we'll see that get deployed as well. And once again, I'll go back. I'll look at my topology. I'll see another container that's starting to be created. And if you see the light blue ring, it means it's starting its process. The dark blue ring means it's done. And once again, I can click on this. I can see the ports. Those ports are coming from the server.xml that was part of the container. I can view the logs. And we'll once again pause until it starts to kick off. And it's kicking off the process. And once again, we will see where it invokes the Maximo servlets and starts the process of connecting to the Maximo database, loading the system properties, and loading all the actual services of Maximo itself. Okay, well, so Maximo is ready for client connections. Now, there's one more step we need to take, and that is we need to expose an external route into the given container itself. Now, before we expose that route, I just want to show you a command that will show you the status of those pods from a non-UI perspective. So we can run OC get pods -n and then the project name. So my project was MX76, and I could see that they completed the deployment perspective and then that they're running. So now let's create a service route or an exposure into that container. So we're going to go OC expose SVC service, the name of the service. So I want the UI, so I'm going to say Maximo, which is what I called my UI. And then I'm going to hit enter, and it's now exposed a route into that container. And I can validate that by going back here, going back to my topology. And now I have this little icon which opens the URL, which opens that route. So right now it tacked on my name to my fully qualified domain name. Now if I go here and I put the Maximo ending, it should now launch us into Maximo, and it does. So let me just log in here as our trusty Wilson. And there we have it. Maximo 7.6 deployed and successfully logged on in an OpenShift environment. And if we look at the help about, we won't see OpenShift anywhere, but we will see from a OS perspective, because OpenShift is running Linux behind the scenes, we will see the Linux version, which corresponds to the worker nodes on the OpenShift cluster itself. And there you have it. We've successfully walked through step by step the process of deploying Maximo 7.6 to an OpenShift environment. I hope this was helpful. As I stated earlier, I am going to put in the description the link to the document or documentation that I was using to go through this walkthrough. Feel free to drop a comment or drop a question if there's something that I can answer. Thank you and have a great day.